Firstly, I must say I feel a bit odd being a representative of the media in Australia, because I'm pretty sure I'm not a very typical representative. I'll give you my background first. I actually lived and studied as a journalist in South Africa, and I'm about to go and start working as a journalist, and I had my residence terminated and had to return to Australia. But it created a completely different perspective on, I guess, most journalists have some element of social advocacy in their makeup when they go to journalism, but in me it became very much stronger as a result of my experience living in another country that was just so much less advantaged in so many ways. But at the same time, I would also say it was so much better at tapping into its own strengths and resources to make a difference and make a change happen. So I brought that to Australia. I worked in a regional newspaper, the Latrobe Valley Express, for half a dozen years. That period coincided with the quite systematic dismantling of the SEC, the old public service ethos of it, the obligations to community that existed. It was corporatised. The workforce of the Latrobe Valley power industry went from more than 20,000, finished up at somewhere around 2,000, I guess. And the community was devastated by it. Then I ended up at the Age, where I spent 20 years. I never intended to be there. Actually, I was in Geelong for a couple of years, so I had more regional city experience. And I still live in Geelong, even after 20 years of working in Melbourne. And a big part of the reason is simply it still functions as a community. I can reasonably expect to walk down the street and see someone I know. Then I've been in Melbourne, working in Melbourne at the Age for 20 years. And I still get startled when I see someone I know randomly walking down the street. My wife would gently mock me about this because I was a chief leader writer for the Age, so the daily editorial, I wrote that. And she said, "You're writing about a city and you don't think you're remotely part of it." But she also actually, the other aspect that she mocked was, she said, "You know what you do? You write secular sermons." Because of all the elements of a newspaper, the one aspect about what should be, what needs to be done, what is the right thing to do, the daily editorial is that. And from that perspective, that is, for an ethically motivated journalist, that's one of the most satisfying and most frustrating things to do all at once. Because for a start, you soon become aware that only a very small section of the audience actually reads those things diligently. And at the same time, that's your most influential movers and shakers. You could see it have an effect sometimes, because the consolation the editor would always offer me is, "Oh, well, the people that matter are reading it, John." Which always created a real feeling of conflict in me, because I didn't write for a certain section of people that mattered. In my mind, actually the people who mattered most were the ones who were disadvantaged. Anyway, then we've had a period of quite dramatic disruption and verging on chaos in the media, and especially in the newspaper industry. And the period where journalists who had, I guess, ethical motivations could find a place to write, somewhere to put it in the paper, and an audience to read it, that was a golden age that is now gone. The old wall that existed between the commercial concerns of the publisher and the journalists has vanished. So journalists used to say, "This is important, I'm going to write about it. I don't care if anybody reads it, I'm going to write about it because it's got to get out there." Now we're in an age of extraordinary cost cutting. And it coincides with the I've actually also got this program after I've been travelling on train. So we've had the revolution of technology that has transformed the way people provide information and the way they consume it. And the newspapers bore the brunt of it. They had journalists were expensive in their view. They filled the space between the ads, and the ads were disappearing. So the journalists disappeared at quite a rate too. And then came the technology that enabled you to know exactly who was reading what. And today you have the situation where journalists' KPIs explicitly include how many people are reading each of their articles, and they have to account for why you're not producing articles that are better read. Same goes, television ratings has been the case for much longer. And it's no coincidence or accident that television does far less of what you would recognise as respectable current affairs, serious journalism, because their rating is driven. And this is where you come to what I would call the kind of horror of contemporary journalism. We always suspected that the kind of stories about things that are important, things that we want to change, making the world a better place, we always suspected that they struggled for an audience, but we did them anyway. Now we get the figures, the daily data, and it's no longer a quarterly circulation figure that goes to the advertisers. It's the daily feedback. They can see what's being read as it's being read. And they won't advertise with you if you're not being read. And that data shows, I think, something that's profoundly damning about us as consumers of news media. I tend to sum it up as, if it's about others, we're not interested. Others are foreigners, the dispossessed, indigenous, the homeless, the unemployed, youth generally. All those categories do very badly. And I'd argued over the past years that we should be doing more articles on those issues. But the numbers say that even when we do those stories, the audience is small. So there's a small core of concerned people who feel it's their obligation to be informed, who read those, but very much more brutal and ruthless industry, those stories become harder and harder to justify the cost of somebody actually going out and doing them. So that's how I ended up leaving Fairfax, because I was actually about to leave journalism and I watched a whole room full of people disappear who were basically the people I respected as journalists, who wrote serious stories about serious issues, about the need for change. They couldn't find a place for their work anymore. They felt unloved. So I eventually left. As it happened, then the founder and managing editor of The Conversation got wind of the redundancy round coming and contacted me out of the blue, that would I be interested in joining them. The Conversation essentially is founded on a very simple but very brilliant idea that in a world full of huge challenges and complex problems, wicked problems, there's something faintly ludicrous about a journalist knowing nothing about the subject in the morning, going out, rushing for a few hours to try and find out as much as they can, writing up a story that neatly and clearly explains that very, very complicated problem in a way that's understandable to a member of the public who hasn't been paying much attention until now to that issue. The proposition is that academics who have been studying this actually have a great depth of knowledge that they can bring to bear. They can come to a report and they're familiar with all the concepts and they can analyse it, or they can cut to an issue or a daily policy debate, whatever's come up to use, and they bring a whole background to it. Now, I happen not insulting too many people, but a lot of academics are pretty terrible communicators in terms of communicating with someone who hasn't got a tertiary education or hasn't been studying that subject. So our job as journalists is to take their initial go at boiling down the issue and turning it into, we aim for somebody who's got a year 10 education, can read it and understand it, which is sometimes traumatic for the academic. But I think the point about it is it aims to be as broad and as inclusive as any journalism can be on complicated big issues of the day. And it has, one other side, I used to wonder as a professional paid journalist, I used to wonder about the ethics of having unpaid, relying purely on the unpaid writing of academics. I've come to realise that actually they get quite a fair deal out of it. It's more than repays its effort in terms of finding an audience and getting tremendously responsive feedback, research partnerships, all kinds of things. It turns out that this is as engaged an audience as any other I've ever worked with. Now the problem is though, that if we've got a proposition here, that we've got a series of ethical goals that we want to achieve, and we're agreeing on what those are. And in fact, it's the things we teach our children. Care, share. And then probably once they get to about high school, we tell them, forget all that, go out and think for all your words. It's a very individualistic society. But essentially those goals are things we can all agree on in the abstract. But having those goals and having those messages you want to communicate is now much more challenging to go out and communicate them, because there is no monolith media to go out and say, well, if we can get them to run our press releases or we can get an interview on TV, we've got the audience. Because the audience is absolute fragmented fraction. We no longer say, well, you've got the morning newspaper, which people read almost out of obligation, the daily news radio, and the evening TV, we've got the bases covered. That's only a minority of people now rely on those for their source of information. Especially if we're talking about the marginalised, we're then into another area of difficulty. What are our assumptions about the smart cities? People are connected. The problem is, if you're marginalised, even most homeless people actually have a handset, a digital handset, but they're constantly running out of credit. They're constantly finding difficulty getting access to, who's got an ISP if you can't pay them? And then the young people who we want to include, well, most of them don't read newspapers, most of them don't watch television news, most of them don't actually use the conventional means of consuming news at all. They rely on social media. That's their primary source of news and information. And at that stage, you will say, well, if you want to try and manage social media, good luck to you. It just makes communicating these goals, these messages, so much more difficult. Okay, I'll just finish up by saying that. So that's the kind of horror story perspective. And we are in a world where, because of the commercial imperatives, the media are, if they're honest with themselves, so much more just about entertainment and clickbait. What's going to pique the interest? What's going to amuse people? What's going to distract them from the world? And in fact, what we want to do is quite the opposite. We want to engage them with the real issues of the world. And we've got a situation which a recent survey said of Australian journalists found only 30% or so, from memory, thought their role was social advocacy, which I would imagine is some kind of historic low. Historically, most journalists, their ideal was to go out and make a difference for the better in the world. But then I'll go back to South Africa. And I was also engaged in student politics there. And this was in the early 80s, and so peak of apartheid, peak of paranoia too. And if they could manage to organise, communicate, engage, and bring about change in those circumstances, well, then surely, despite all those challenges of communication in a country like this, we surely can too. And the fact is that the other positive I see is that we have a generation growing up now that no longer thinks in terms of neat and quarantine borders, which I actually think of national borders as excuses that quarantine us from our responsibilities for the world. Whereas young people tend to think more naturally. Once you're on the internet and you've got friends overseas you've never met but you still know them all, it's that much harder to quarantine yourself. And I don't actually have a bloody clue about how you manage a media campaign in that world. But the fact is that those global connections are already in place. And young people are, no question, have given up on formal politics as we know it. But they are intensely political. They're on the wrong end of developments in this country. Their work is so precarious. They study hard, they do all the right things, they come out to crappy casual jobs. They are more open to change. And the issue is that the old media are at the intersection of political and economic power and influence. And I was glad to hear Tim Costello make the point that it's actually very hard to get a hearing for what might be common prescriptions of decency and ethical behaviour, but they're presented as radical. They're seen as radical and threatening. And even something like coffee in Melbourne, the lifeblood of Melbourne. We are inextricably linked to the disaster of the of that supply chain without question where that comes from and how much produced. And the fact is, in media terms, we have the capacity to find out about it better than ever before. So we cannot just rely on the old media to do that for us. We actually have the means, in a way that we never did before, to use the media for our own ends. And I think that's, I guess, the main message in the end is that the media is what we make of it these days.
Great. Thank you very much.